Hello and welcome to this digital workshop. My name is Strober and I'm going to be your instructor throughout this entire video training series. Now this course has been designed in a way which is hopefully going to take a novice photographer and transform them into being an advanced photographer by the end of the course. Now we're going to be doing this via 3 sections of training. That being the first section being the basics of photography, the second section being the intermediate of photography, and the third section being the advanced skills needed from photographers. So now you know that we're going to be doing 3 parts, basics, intermediate and advanced. Then you should also know that in order to help me better explain to you guys, I am going to be working with a state-of-the-art digital SLR simulator, which is going to help me describe to you guys real life scenarios of how digital SLRs do work and operate in the field. So right guys, go make yourself a quick cup of tea, grab yourself a pen and paper. Also, remember to turn your smartphones onto silence and let's get your photography training started. Should you shoot in RAW or should you shoot in JPEG? This is a question that many new photographers ask time and time again. So let's try and understand the difference between JPEG and RAW a little bit more then. So basically, let's say we take a photograph, the same photograph, we shoot it in RAW and we also shoot it in JPEG. This means now that we have got the same photograph in 2 different file formats. Now let's transfer these file formats to our computer, and what do we see? Well, first of all, we can see that the RAW file format is basically just displayed as a file. And then if we have a look at the JPEG file format, we can see that it actually displays the photograph within the thumbnail of the actual file itself. So how can this be? Well, basically what it is, JPEG is a very popular, common file format that is used by many different applications, such as cameras, printers, smartphones, consoles, etc. All these kind of applications can easily read the JPEG file format. However, they cannot read the more complicated RAW file format. So now we understand that JPEG is used a lot more by more applications. Then let's better understand JPEG and RAW even more. The next understanding we have of JPEG and RAW is then the size of it. Basically, the JPEG photograph is a lot smaller in size than what it is of the large RAW format. So let me give you a perspective of the difference in size. If we have a look at the photograph where we are taking in the large JPEG format, then we can see that 3.25 megabytes is the current size of that JPEG format. However, if we have a look at the size of the RAW format, even though it's the same photograph, we can see it is a whopping 9.14 megabytes in size. Yeah, guys, you read that? 9.14 megabytes in size compared to the 3.25 megabytes of the JPEG. So let's say hypothetically you're shooting your camera with a 16 gigabyte memory card. That means the RAW file format is going to give you less photographs for your memory card. However, the JPEG format is going to give you more photographs for your DSLR's memory card. So what is exactly the main difference then between RAW format and the JPEG format? Well, the main difference is that JPEG is compressed and RAW format is uncompressed. This is why the RAW file is so much bigger in size than the JPEG. It's because it contains a lot more data and a lot more information about the photograph than what the JPEG file format does. But because you know you're brand new to photography, my advice to you is to just stick with shooting in JPEG. There's nothing wrong with shooting in the JPEG file format, because again, if you shoot in the RAW file format, then you'll need to use specialist software in order to decode the RAW file. So for now, just stick to shooting in JPEG, as again, JPEG is the most popular common file format that a lot of applications does read. But at least you have a better understanding now of what JPEG and RAW is. Autofocus. Understanding autofocus. Every new photographer needs to master how to use their autofocus on their new digital SLR. So let's begin with the basics of autofocus. Autofocus is the automatic principle of the camera working out the distance it is that your subject is away from the camera. Now, the process to activate autofocus is known as the half press. So what you would do is when you half press your shutter release button, you now activate the autofocus mode. This then sees the camera start to search and work out the distance it is that your subject is away from the camera. Now, once it's locked on, you should see a visual indicator or hear an audio beep from your digital SLR. Once you see or hear this, this means that you're ready to take the photograph. So when you fully depress the shutter release button, you should now see a nice, sharp, in focus photograph of your subject. So that is the basic principle of how autofocus does work. But there actually is two types of autofocus. We have single autofocus and then we have continuous autofocus. So what is the difference between single autofocus and continuous autofocus? Well, single autofocus basically records a set distance your subject is away from the camera, and it locks this set distance into the memory of the camera. Whereas continuous autofocus, on the other hand, that does not. It constantly keeps looking for the subject. So let me give you a working example. Let's say that we wanted to photograph a person stood in front of a flyer background, and let's say we used single autofocus. Then what happens is when we half press the button, single autofocus will work out the distance it is that the person is away from the camera. Now that distance is logged into the memory of the camera. So this now allows us to recompose the shot, because remember, we already know how far the person is away from the camera. So the single autofocus allows us to recompose the shot without any problems, because our person is always going to be in focus no matter what, because they're at a set distance. However, continuous autofocus does not work like this, because if we'd done the same thing with continuous autofocus and we try to recompose our shot, what would happen is instead of focusing on the person still, the continuous autofocus would now focus on the background. So let me give you an example of continuous focus and where you would use it. Continuous autofocus is brilliant for sports photographers, those who photograph soccer, horse racing, basketball, boxing, etc, etc. Here's how continuous autofocus works. When you half press your shutter release button in continuous autofocus mode, your camera will lock onto the distance it is that your subject is at. Now, when your subject starts to move and you move with your subject, if your subject comes closer to you, then the camera will readjust its focus in order to keep that person in focus. If your subject moves away from you, then continuous autofocus will refocus its focus in order to keep the person moving away from you in focus. So as you can understand now, continuous autofocus, no matter what, will constantly keep adjusting its focus for a moving subject. So to finish with, continuous autofocus is used on moving subjects, and single autofocus is used on still subjects. So I would use single autofocus on product photography, such as photographing, aftershave, perfume, etc. Subjects that just don't move. Whereas continuous autofocus I would use on moving subjects such as soccer players, basketball, boxes, horse racing, etc. Rally sports. So there you go. Now you have a better understanding of what autofocus is with your digital SLR. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is by far one of the main things you need to learn as a new photographer. But what is shutter speed? Quite simply, shutter speed is the length of time that photographers allow light to strike the camera's sensor. That is what shutter speed is. Now, you need to understand that shutter speed is measured in what we call stops. So this means that we can overexpose a photograph by one stop, or we can underexpose a photograph by one stop, or we could overexpose a photograph by 3 stops, or we can underexpose a photograph by 3 stops. So again, the metering system of shutter speed is known as stops. Another important thing you need to know about shutter speed is if you use too much shutter speed, then you're gonna overexpose your photograph. If you use too little of a shutter speed, then you're gonna underexpose your photograph. Now, shutter speed can be used as an artistic effect. For example, a slow shutter speed blurs something, whereas a fast shutter speed freezes something. So if we have a look at this dancer, and if we use a slow shutter speed, we can see that his dance movements has now become a blur. However, if we use a fast shutter speed, then we can see that we have now frozen our dancer. So shutter speed can be used as an artistic effect. For example, light trails, star trails, etc. Now, if you use long exposure, then you can use it to slightly overexpose an image. When you slightly overexpose an image, then you give that image a nice, fresh, crisp, clean look and feel to it. When you use shutter speed to slightly underexpose a photograph, then what happens there is that you're giving your photograph a more moody, dramatic, eerie feel about it. So shutter speed is a valuable tool that you really need to master and experiment with as a new photographer. Just like ISO shutter speed, then aperture is very important for the new photographer to learn and understand. So what is aperture? Quite frankly, aperture is the size of the hole inside the lens that attaches to your camera. Now, it's very important that you understand aperture, because Aperture allows light to pass through your lens and strike your camera's sensor. Now, a wide aperture allows more light to pass through the lens into the camera sensor. A narrow aperture allows less light to pass through the lens and strike your camera's sensor. Now, just like ISO and shutter speed, Aperture too works with the stop system. So this means that you can allow in 1 stop's worth more of light via your aperture, or you can allow in 1 stop's less light with aperture. If you wanted to, you could allow in 2 stops more worth of light with aperture, or you could let in 2 stops less worth of light with aperture. So again, you understand that aperture, just like shutter speed and ISO, works with the stop system. Now, there's a thing called F numbers with regards to aperture. So that means that every size of the hole has got a thing called an F number. For example, a wide aperture such as f1.4 looks like this, okay? And a narrow aperture of f11 looks like this. Now, this is the hardest bit to understand with regards to aperture. Have a look at f11. Notice it's a big number, but the hole is small. And now let's have a look at f1.4. Notice that the hole is big, but the number is small. When working with F numbers in photography, i.e. aperture numbers, you have to remember that a large number represents a small hole and a small number represents a big hole. I know it's hard to understand, but trust me, once you start to understand it and you accept it, life as a photographer becomes so much easier. Now, moving on, aperture being used as an artistic effect. We always use aperture with regards to an artistic effect. That's why aperture is so important in photography, because aperture gives us a thing called depth of field. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is quite frankly the zone of focus. So let me give you an example of depth of field in action. So if we have a look at this photograph here, we can see we have got a thing called a shallow depth of field. So this means that this photograph was taken on a wide aperture, because wide apertures give us shallow depths of field, like we see in the photograph here. However, this photograph, even though it is exactly the same, we shot on a narrow aperture, because a narrow aperture gives us a lot more extended depth of field within our photographs. So as you can understand by now, a narrow aperture gives you an extended depth of field, and a wide aperture gives you a shallow depth of field. Some people normally refer to a shallow depth of field as being bokeh, but I just call it the depth of field. Now, a key note what you need to know about aperture is that a wide aperture basically helps to isolate a subject from its background, and a narrow aperture helps to include the background into the actual photograph of your subject itself. For example, if you're a landscape photographer, then you're going to be using a narrow aperture in order to get very sharp depth of field within your photographs. If you're like if you're being a portrait photographer, then you would want to isolate your subject from the background, which is where you would use a wide aperture in order to give that shallow depth of field. So there you go, guys. There's a better understanding of what aperture is in photography. ISO. The next important thing you need to learn in photography is ISO. So what is ISO? Basically, ISO is the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to absorb light once it is exposed to it. So this means that we can manually set the sensitivity of the camera's sensor in order to absorb light. For example, if we use a low ISO, then this means the sensor is less sensitive to light. If we use a high ISO, this means that our sensor has become more sensitive to light. So this means a low ISO needs more light, and it means that a high ISO needs less light. ISO, just like shutter speed, is measured with the stops system. You can overexpose the photograph by giving it one stop of ISO. You can underexpose the photograph by giving it one stop less worth of ISO. So too much ISO will overexpose your photograph. Too little ISO will underexpose your photograph. Now, ISO being used as an artistic effect. A low ISO gives your images a feel as if you're looking into a mirror. What I mean about this is that a low ISO gives you a very clear, sharp, crisp, clean, as if you're looking at the reflection of yourself kind of photograph. Whereas a high ISO, on the other hand, that gives you a very grainy, hard looking image. So you can use both of these effects to your advantage as a photographer. For example, if you're going to photograph a boxer, then the chances are you would use a high ISO, very grainy, in order to make the boxer look very tough and hard and more aggressive. And you'd probably use the lower ISO for a more crystal glass looking effect with regards to product photography, like aftershave or perfume, for example. So that is basically ISO in all its contexts. Remember, ISO works with a stop system, and too much ISO will overexpose your image and too little will underexpose your image. When you look through your digital SLR for the very first time, then you'll probably see this. You'll definitely see it when you go into manual mode on your digital SLR. So what is this? This is what we call a Lightmeter. Now, a Lightmeter's job is to help assist the photographer with working out what is the technically perfect lighting levels for a photograph. Now, if we have a look at our Lightmeter, we can see that we have this indicator in the center of the Lightmeter. Now, this is the indication to the photographer that we have got the perfect lighting levels. That's because the indicator is in the center of the Lightmeter. So if we take a photograph now, we will see that the Lightmeter was correct. We do have a perfectly even, balanced, well exposed, technically perfect photograph. However, sometimes the Lightmeter can make mistakes, And this is where a photographer will then dial into the camera what the exposure should be. They will do this via adjusting the Shutterspeed, ISO or Aperture. Now, as you can see on the Lightmeter, we have some digits and then we have a negative sign and we have a positive sign. So what is a negative digit? Well, a negative digit is quite simply darker, and a positive digit is quite simply brighter. So let's go back to having the first photograph that we took. This is the technically perfect, well balanced exposed photograph. And as we can see, the indicator is in the middle of the Lightmeter. Now let's say we wanted, for creative reasons, just creative freedom, we wanted to make the photograph much darker. Then what we can do is we can use the Lightmeter and dial down to a negative number. In my case, I'm going to dial all the way down to -2. Now if we take the photograph, we can see that is a much darker image. And that's because we have moved down by a full 2 stops worth of less light. So if we wanted to make the image brighter, then we could simply just use a positive digit. So in this case, I'm going to use a positive digit of 2. And as you can see on my Lightmeter, we're now at +2. I take my photograph and hey presto, the photograph is now much more brighter than what we originally had. So as you can see, this is how a Lightmeter does work. The digit 1 and the digit 2 represents either 1 or 2 stops worth of light. Negative being darker and positive being brighter. So there you go guys, and now you understand how Lightmeters do work with regards to your digital SLR. Composition and confidence. Composition and confidence is the two main things why I feel that lets down new photographers. So let's discuss what I mean. Well, with regards to composition, I feel that new photographers tend to be just, shutter happy, and all they do really is go click, 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 and they pay no attention to the composition of their photographs. So this means that their photographs are very cluttered with random objects and subjects. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly use the example of you working with a model in the park for the very first time with regards to composition. So let's say you're working with a model in the park for the very first time and you take this photograph. Now don't get me wrong, I like the composition of this photograph, but this is my point. The model is the main subject of your photograph, but in this photograph I personally see 4 different subjects. I see the model, I see a park bench, I see a brick wall, and I see the rocks of the mountain in the background. So what I'm saying is that the rocks in the background, the brick wall and the bench distract me from the main focus of the photograph, which is to be the model. So if I was to take this shot personally, I would do something like this. As you can see, I've decluttered the image and now I'm only left with the model's face and the rocks in the background. So that is basically 2 subjects that I'm left with. So that's what I'm talking about, composition. I've decluttered my images. Now it doesn't have to be rocks in the background, it could be a beautiful blue sky. But nonetheless, my point is that experienced photographers tend to isolate their subjects and declutter their images. Now, moving on, another thing what new photographers need to take into consideration with regards to composition is then their angles. New photographers should not be afraid to experiment with their angles of composition. For example, get up close to your subject, get up tall to your subject, look down on your subject, take low angles and look up at your subject, you know, be like a spider's web and come at your subject from many different photographic angles. And again, you know, it's something that you need to do in order to get those shots that you want. So now I'm going to move on to the confidence of a photographer. Confidence is something that I feel lets many photographers down. Some new photographers are overconfident, and then when their subject gets the photos, it turns out they're the worst photos in the world. Some photographers tend to be underconfident, which means that if they've got, you know, a bad subject, that they could be walking away feeling like they're a useless photographer and they're never going to be a good photographer simply because they lack confidence. So what I'm going to do now is quickly talk about confidence with regards to new photographers. So if you're a new photographer, don't be afraid to be confident. Please try and find a balance in between being overconfident and underconfident. Just try and find that unique balance. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're working with a model in the park, and let's say you're not getting the photograph that you wanted. You wanted, you know, you want the model to go that extra mile, but you don't want to ask the model to go the extra mile. Guess what? This is where you need confidence, okay? In order for you to get that shot you want in your head, you need to turn around, say to the model, excuse me, let me show you this. This is what I'm currently getting. As you can see, it doesn't look that great. This is what I'm thinking, blah, blah, blah. Is there any chance that you can, blah, blah, blah? And then the model will make the decision if to help you or not. Remember, if you don't ask, you don't get. But what I'm saying to you guys is if you're being underconfident, then you're not going to get the shots it is that you want. And the next thing I want to move on about confidence is with regards to like the general public. Let's say you are photographing a wedding for the very first time, and let's say you are photographing a group of people. Now let's say for some unknown reason that two people within this group has had an argument on that particular day, and let's say all the group is compactly nice together and making a good photograph, but let's say these two people that had an argument have created a space within the group. Now that may be distracting and may be destroying the photograph. So as a photographer, it's up to you to develop the confidence to say to the person that's, you know, ruining an image, excuse me, please can you get closer because it doesn't look very good as the photograph. 9 times out of 10, they're going to react to the photographer and move closer. So this is what I'm saying with regards to photographers having confidence. You need to be confident with people and tell them what you want as a photographer. You know, I hope this helps you guys, because again, with new photographers, you need to attack your subject from many different angles. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be shy. And most of all, be confident. Don't be overconfident. Don't be underconfident. Happy snapping and well done. You've just completed the first part of this online course.